Hello, trig students. This is going to be a video describing how to graph one period of sine, and we are going to do a positive sine example and a negative sine example. Alright, so we'll start with 3 sine 2x plus pi. The first thing we want to do is find the period, and this is 2 pi divided by the b value, which in this equation b is equal to 2. So we have a period of pi. And if you're wondering how I figured out what b is, the generic form for sine is a sine bx plus c plus d. Okay, and then the next step is to find the interval. And what you do is you set the argument of sine, the bx plus c part, between 0 and 2 pi. And then you solve for x in the middle. So like first we need to subtract pi from all sides. And then divide everything by 2. And this tells us the interval in which that we're going to graph the sine function. And then we take that interval size and we divide it by 4. So your interval size is always going to be the period divided by 4. And this is going to tell us how we're going to label the x-axis. Alright, and then next we need to find the amplitude, which is just the a value. So the amplitude is 3. And then the midline. Now the midline is usually the d value, but here we don't have a d value, so the midline is 0. And lastly, we identify what a type of function we're dealing with here, which is a sine function. So it starts at the midline, and then it's going to go up the amplitude, back to the midline, down the amplitude, back to the midline. So that's kind of the pattern that positive sine follows. And now we're ready to graph. So we'll set up our axes. And we're going to be starting at negative pi halves. And then you're adding the interval over 4 each time. So that pi over 4, you're adding that every single time. So the next tick mark is going to be at negative pi over 4. And then you add another pi over 4 and you'll get 0. And then again add pi over 4. And again add pi over 4. Okay, so we're going to start at the very left side of our interval. This is a positive sine function, so it starts at the midline. Then the next interval tick mark, you're going to go up the amplitude, back to the midline, down the amplitude, back to the midline. So there's our graph of 3 sine 2x plus pi. Okay, what about a negative sine function? We're going to start it the same exact way. We have a period of 2 pi divided by b, which is 2 pi thirds. And then our interval is going to be 0 less than or equal to 3x minus pi halves less than or equal to 2 pi. And we'll start by adding pi halves to each side. And then we're going to divide all the sides by 3. And there's our interval, pi 6 to 5 pi 6. And then we're going to take our interval size and divide it by 4. So that's going to be the same as our period, which is 2 pi thirds. And we're dividing this by 4, which is equal to pi over 6. All right, we have an amplitude of 2 and a midline of 1. Midline. And this is a negative sine function. So a negative sine function follows the pattern of starting at the midline, and instead of going up the amplitude first, you go down So it's kind of like the reverse of that positive sine function. So that's the pattern we're going to follow, and we're ready to graph. We're going to start at pi over 6 because that's the beginning of the interval, and then you're adding pi over 6 each time. So when you add pi over 6 next, you'll get pi thirds, then you'll get pi halves, and then you'll get 2 pi 6, 3 pi 6, 2 pi thirds, and one more, you'll get 5 pi over 6. And you'll notice if you've done it correctly, like the left and right endpoints should match your interval that you have. So our interval was pi 6 to 5 pi 6, and our interval matches our x-axis. All right, we have a midline at 1. So I'm going to graph this midline at 1. And since it's a sine function, it will start at the midline, at the left side of the interval. And this is a negative sine function, so we're going to go down the amplitude, which let me move this pi thirds here. We're going to go down 2, back to the midline, up 2, back to the midline. So there's our graph of -2 sine 3x minus pi halves plus 1. If you have any questions about how to graph sine, please feel free to ask me, and I'm more than happy to do more examples for you guys. Thanks.